All right, hi everybody. Yeah, like you already heard, I am Doug Northcook, and I am the head of VR fund at Robot Teddy, and I'm going to talk to you about designing tasty virtual reality experiences. And what do I mean by tasty? We'll kind of unpack that, but with virtual reality specifically. We're kind of entering into this new phase of game design where the way that I have started to think about this is that we are moving from uh, designing games to something that is more like architecture, um, and that it's less like programming and coding and more like designing objects or physical things. Um, And this is why there are so few breakout virtual reality games that have been able to sell like more than 1 million copies. And all of those games that break out, like games like Super Hot VR, who we work with, they have some of this tastiness, some of this magic. Um, and when I'm talking about this specifically about architecture and objects, it's really that designing virtual reality games is so much more like designing things for the real world than it is like designing a traditional video game. That it is so much more about our physical bodies in physical space, and the feeling that we have there, which is very different to holding a controller like an Xbox controller where I'm controlling a character that exists on a flat screen, right? Where when I'm playing a virtual reality game, I am the character. My body is the controller. Um, and when we first started out with virtual reality in this kind of new wave that started really about 10 years ago with the first Oculus developer kit, which you see here, um, we didn't really bring our whole bodies in. You actually see someone, the guy on the left, holding an Xbox controller, playing a game in the headset. And really, it's just we brought our heads into the game, right? So they're moving their heads back and forth. Um, and this is where we get this original, like, sense of embodiment and presence, but it's really just a head. Um, and then I was trying to convert this from a WebM video earlier, but I'm just going to pull it up and play it. So moving from heads to this is a demo for a game that is now out, that I played like 3 years ago. This is a video from that. This is a game called Space Pirate Arena, which is a game mode of a game called Space Pirate Trainer, where you are actually running around in a very large physical space with another player, also with a virtual reality headset on, and using your entire body as a controller against another player who also has their body in the same physical space as you. So I'm just going to play uh, this video so you can see what I'm talking about. Um, right. And like, this is a very different experience than playing a game on a console where you are physically running around and it becomes so much more about the space where you see right here, there's like a near collision between these two players where they are so close to each other. But they have such an incredible sense of presence and awareness of their own bodies in that space that they're able to almost run into each other, but not actually collide. Um, and it's just something really distinct from traditional game development, where it really is more about human bodies in physical space, right? And with VR games, right, like the physical space that you occupy is maybe your living room or maybe a small room in your basement that is just like an empty box. But the worlds that we create within that do have this sense of embodiment and presence. Um, and that's what really kind of drives these experiences home. The space that we occupy, I have kind of jokingly started referring to as meat space. Um, that like we bring our like weird meat bodies into these digital spaces, and that we're just these weird meat creatures running around trying to figure out what to do. Um, So Simone de Beauvoir, who is a old French feminist philosopher, says that our body, the body, is the instrument of our hold on the world. And in an email exchange I had with Jesse Schell, the founder of Shell Games and a really amazing VR designer, Jesse sent me an email. He said that VR allows us to bring our bodies into the digital realm. And that this is something completely new, right? Like completely unique, and that there are really unique challenges to creating these kinds of experiences and really getting these, like, people talk in game design about juicy games, and I've started talking about VR games as tasty games, because they're if I have a glass of juice, that satisfies me a little bit, but if I have like a whole meal, um, that's tasty. And there's an opportunity with VR games to create these entirely new human experiences that go beyond anything that we're able to accomplish with traditional console and PC games. So back to like physical object design. Someone who I have encouraged a lot of designers that I work with to read. There's a designer named Don Norman, who's an industrial and product designer who is like an early design engineer at Apple and at Microsoft, and is kind of the godfather of product and industrial design as it has gotten translated into user experience design for mobile application software, all of these kinds of things. So what I've done here is I'm going to kind of lay out these 7 core principles from Norman and how they translate directly into designing virtual reality experiences, and give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about, that are games that you can go and play yourself. So the first one is discoverability. And each of these sections is kind of adapted specifically from Don Norman's book, that's called The Design of Everyday Things, if you wanted to read this for yourself. So discoverability, that it is possible to determine what actions are possible and the current state of the device. So that when I encounter an object in the world, I am able to interact with it, and I am myself able to discover what is possible with this object. I'll talk about an example of that. And then the second is feedback, that there is full and continuous information about the results of my actions and the current state of the product, the service, the environment, the object, and that after an action has been executed, it is easy to determine the new state, right? So and we see this all the time in games, right? This could be a particle system, this could be some sort of overlay. But in VR, it has to be multi-sensory, right? There's visual information, there's audio information, there's haptic information in the controllers. There's a lot of different pieces of this. Um, so a lot of examples of games I'm going to give you are pretty early virtual reality games. And part of that is that these are games that are either very cheap or free in some cases, and are great titles for you to think about trying out and exploring to see some of this for yourself as you're thinking about working on these kinds of games. So when we're talking about discoverability, that I am able to discover what is possible with an object. There's this great game from Crows and Squanch Games, called Accounting, which was originally released as a free demo on Steam, and is now a full game called Accounting Plus. And this game is all about discoverability. It's all about finding these objects and then figuring out what you're supposed to do with them. So you've got in this specific scene that we have an image of, you find a jar full of stomach acid that specifically says "do not drink" on it. And then you can pour that bottle onto the environment. You can drink it. You can throw it. You can actually yourself discover all these possible relationships, between the object and the environment, which is very different from designing a traditional game where most objects in the world are static. You can't pick them up. You can't interact with them. And there's not necessarily an expectation in a traditional console game that I can pick up every object in an environment. But in virtual reality games, the user expects that if there's an object and I can put my hand out and touch it, that I should be able to do something with it, that I should be able to discover something with that. And I think part of this is designing for transgression. That anytime you see a user put on a virtual reality headset, try a game for the first time, they immediately start reaching for every object that they can find, and they try to smash it, they try to break it, they try to throw it out the window. That people want to act on the world in ways that they don't necessarily try to do in other games. And part of this is this desire to do things that I can't do in the real world. That if I walked into someone's home in the real world, I'm not supposed to grab a mug and just throw it against a wall. But in virtual reality, I can do that. So I kind of want to try to do it. And so if we go from, first thing, discoverability. Second thing, feedback. This is seen from a very early VR prototype game that I worked on. And the designer, Mike, who I worked on this with, came up with this great feedback system for a telekinesis mechanic where you could point your hand at an object and it would put an outline around the object to tell me that I had selected that object. And then I would have visual feedback to show me where the object would move. And I was able to pull objects to my hand and catch them. If you've seen Half-Life Alyx, the VR game from Valve, they have a very similar mechanic with their gravity gloves, where I'm able to do with audio, with visuals, and with haptics in the controllers, able to develop these relationships with these very physical mechanics where the feedback is clear enough that I can actually develop an intuition. I can develop the ability to myself pull and manipulate objects in three-dimensional space in a way that's very different from just I click the mouse and then the object comes to me. It's with this, I'm actually pulling objects in different directions. Okay, we can go through a couple more of these. Next is conceptual models, which is how we think things are, that the design projects all the information needed to actually create a good conceptual model of the system, leading to an understanding and a feeling of control. I'll talk about an example of this, but these next two, this is one of the most important things I think to try to really wrap your head around for designing tasty virtual reality experiences is affordances and signifiers. And these are two words that get used interchangeably a lot. Affordances being our relationships with things. Right? So I brought up the example earlier of a mug, right? And one of my relationships is I can throw this mug, right? But I can also drink from this mug. I can also grab the mug, but I can grab the mug like this, or I can grab the mug like this, or I can grab it like this. I can stick my hand in it and hold it like this, right? That the possible ways that I interact with this object are nearly limitless, right? And in a traditional 3D game, it might be you grab the object and then it floats in front of you and you carry it around, right? But in VR, I'm actually putting my hand out, grabbing this object, and then my expectation is that I can discover all of the possible affordances, all of the things that should be possible with a mug, which is that I can break it, I can throw it, I can drink from it, I can pour liquids into it. And if you have to program all of those possibilities, right? Either you do that or the user is going to pick up the mug and be like, this isn't a mug. I can't do anything with it. If I can't put liquid in it, then is it a mug, right? Affordances being our relationships with things, and then signifiers being how we perceive those relationships, right? So an example of that would be if this mug had a label on it that said drink, right? The example from accounting is you have this bottle of stomach acid that says do not drink, right? So there's an affordance there, which is that it is a liquid, so I can drink it. But the signifier tells me that is not the relationship that you should have with this object, right? And so much of creating virtual reality games is about giving the user the opportunity to form relationships with the environment and with objects on their own, and that only when we need to do we give them any sort of signifier where we're telling them explicitly what to do. So we're talking about conceptual models. Superhot, I think, is one of the best examples of this, which is that Superhot is an incredibly unique experience that changes your conceptual model of time, which is a thing that I've never seen any game or any experience that you can have as a person do this, where if you play Superhot for 20 minutes in VR, you will actually start to perceive time in the way that the game portrays it, which is that when you don't move, time does not move. So if you stand totally still, nothing happens. And then when you start moving again, time starts moving. Where that I've seen this hundreds of times with users where they play Superhot and then they take off the headset and then they watch people in the room move while they're standing still, and they get very upset because they've internalized very quickly this conceptual model for time that is different than the traditional linear understanding of the way that time works. And this is because of this really immersive, embodied nature of these virtual reality experiences when they are built with these really tight conceptual models where you can change the way that people perceive things that you wouldn't immediately think you would be able to do, like manipulating a user's actual sense of time and presence in their own life. And that this is something unique that I've never seen it happen with a traditional game. And it's really powerful and something worth thinking about, which is how you can subvert user expectations, how you can actually change the way that people see things. And we're talking about affordances and signifiers. Job Simulator, one of the most successful early VR games. I think a big part of, if not the main reason why Job Simulator was so successful, is because they really understand the desire of users to relate to objects in a huge variety of ways. So everything in all of their environments is grabbable, so you can pick up almost every single object in the environment, or you can interact with it in some way. So I can hit every button and that button does something specific. I can grab the mug that's in that environment and I can fill it with liquids and then pour those liquids out and then stick objects into it. If like there's a donut on the desk, I can pick up the donut and I can put it in my mouth, and then I have half of a donut, and then I put it in my mouth and then I have no donut. um, that they Alchemy Labs, the creators of Job Simulator, they have this team that they really get this. They really understand the way that users want to interact in virtual reality spaces, which is that they want to be able to interact with everything in a meaningful way. That like every object has its own affordances programmed into it that are all of these possibilities. And if you've played any of their games, like they made the Rick and Morty VR game, which also has this mechanic in it where you can actually combine objects together. So then you create these new relationships and these new possibilities. Um, but that this is what is the hardest thing about creating VR games, I think, is that like if you want to create a Skyrim sized VR game, it would cost like 10 times what it costs to make Skyrim, because every single environment in the entire world has to be this rich. It has to be full of these really rich and complex interactions that interface with our expectations. Um, and it means that every single room is essentially a game unto itself. And a lot of the really great VR games, especially some of these earlier ones, really lean into that. And they aren't much more than a few rooms. Like Job Simulator is basically a series of small rooms. You're not moving through, like in this office scene, you don't move throughout the office, you stay in your cubicle. But the cubicle is full of all of these rich interactions and is a story and a level unto itself. Okay, two more. Two more. First is mappings, which is how do we actually do things? How do we use the controllers? How do we interact with things like menus and like user experience kind of broadly for these kinds of games. And the last is constraints, which is putting things into the experience that limit what is possible. So for mappings, there's a great early VR game called Vanishing Realms, which was kind of an attempt to make a Zelda-like dungeon crawler. And they did this great thing, which instead of creating an inventory or a menu, they were one of the first ones to put the menu and put your inventory in a physical space with you. So you find a little block of cheese in the dungeon and you pick it up and you put it in your belt, and then you can pull it out of your belt and eat it. Right. So they've changed like traditional mapping for like a game, which would be like I hit the B button to open my inventory, and then I use the joystick to find the cheese, and then I hit the A button to select it. It's like, no, you see the cheese, you grab the cheese, you store the cheese, you eat the cheese. And this is a really difficult problem because when you're trying to create, again, like complex RPG menus and systems, that the traditional way of doing that is to do it through a series of increasingly complicated 2D menus. But really great virtual reality games don't rely on this. I think if you've seen or played Gorilla Tag, which is currently one of the most popular VR multiplayer games, there are no menus in the entire game. All of the user interface is built into the 3D environment itself, which I think is a big part of why that game has been so successful, which is that it really leans all the way into the immersive 3D environment and never lets you bring up a 2D menu, never lets you escape the game world for anything. And lastly, to constraints, I Expect You to Die from Shell Games can be played entirely seated in a chair, and everything is within arm's reach, right? So they really went in on how do we make a game that you don't even have to move to play. You can sit in a chair, which means that anyone can play it, whether or not they have a large play space or they are physically able to move around in it. And they built an entire game around those specific constraints. And I think, again, because virtual reality development can be so costly and so difficult, you need to put a lot of constraints onto your development. You need to put constraints on your visual style and your art to get things to run on mobile hardware. And you need to put constraints on your interactions and your design and how many objects you're going to have in a space so that you don't overscope your title and that you have enough time and budget to build in these really rich small interactions. I'm including this video just because I think this is one of the more interesting possibilities of how we can start to think about virtual reality. This is a demo I played a couple years ago where you actually can grab your own eyeballs off of your head, and then it splits the lenses in the VR headset. So you are controlling your eyes with your hands and moving them in different directions, which makes you feel incredibly sick immediately, first of all. But also, it lets you see two things at once, which is not a thing that we can do or should do necessarily in the real world. But again, like we have the opportunity to discover entirely new ways of not just playing, but also of seeing the world and perceiving it. And I'll hit a couple of things here pretty quickly. One is that I think virtual reality is a great opportunity to forget about realism and not try to create things that are realistic, right? Which we do in games all of the time, but there's a deep desire with a lot of designers that I see to try to create these really realistic virtual reality environments. And this is like the one like philosophical word that I like to bring in here, which is this is this term called verisimilitude, which is not something that is real, but something that appears to be real. And this is what I think a game like Superhot gets really well, which is that the way that time works in Superhot is not real or true. It is not the way that time truly works, but it feels like it is. It in that world, it is consistent enough that it really feels that that's how time works. And that's what creates this really, really rich experience that people keep coming back to and keep wanting to try because it's something completely different that feels true when you play it. Um, that it has this appearance of truthfulness, which is what I am always chasing when we're talking to developers. Um, that we have this opportunity to suspend the user's reality and invite them into a completely different reality where time is different, where they are different, where physics is different, where um, you know anything that we want to be different, and that like it really can feel that way when you build it in a way that feels true inside of the experience. Um, and like I said before, we have the opportunity to develop new intuitions that we can teach people how to use telekinesis, not to like hit a button, but to actually like manipulate an object with their hands and throw it to a different place in the environment. That is an entirely new space for skill-based mechanics um, that are really different, right? Like if you're someone who's really into Dark Souls and Souls-like games, there's something totally different about being good at a Souls-like game in VR where you are actually using the weapons, you are wielding a hammer, um, than being someone who's very good at that with a controller. So I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit and just uh, again go back to that we're really designing for feel, just like how does it feel when I'm in the environment, how does it feel when I pick up an object, and how do I feel, that we're designing for delicious tasty feel. um, and all of this to say, I think like the best way to really learn how to do this is to play the games that other people are making that are doing incredibly well. Because there are some people that really get this, and I think like Superhot is a great example. Gorilla Tag is a great example. Beat Saber, a great example of constraints. But also smaller titles, things like Vanishing Realms, or game. We have a new game that we're working with that comes out next week, actually, called The Last Clockwinder, that I think is worth taking a look at as well. So, but man, oh man, I could talk about this all day, but I'm not going. I'm not going to. So I want to leave time. I know we have some time for questions, so I'm going to stop there and say thanks. Um, but also that if you have questions or want to talk more about this or want recommendations, you can find me on Twitter at Doug Northcook. And if you go to the Robot Teddy website, my email is on the front page, and I'm more than happy to chat about this. So
Thank you very much. Again, it was a great lecture. We have a couple of questions. Are you ready?
ready. Yeah.
You sure?
Yeah. Yeah.
Ju- Let me just find the good layout for this. Yeah, you're the boss here. Okay, cool. So we have a question from Marco. He's saying, "How do we utilize VR as much as possible when when we have limited space? Meaning, how do we play VR games that want us to run around when we live in a small apartment?"
Yeah, totally. Yeah, this is a great question. This is a totally separate talk that I normally do, which is again, like how do we design for these kinds of constraints? And this is something that's really important because not everyone has like the recommended size of play space that like Oculus or Steam VR games like require. So I think part of that is having a variety of locomotion options. So in in the VR design world, we refer to these generally as like teleport, which is where I can point my controller to an area and then hit a button and it will move me in that area in the virtual space, or having smooth locomotion where I can use the joystick to just move myself around in the environment. For some users, though, that causes some amount of motion sickness. So it's good to it's good to have a variety of options for movement, but also that like this isn't just about movement around the space. It's also about like, what if an object that I need to get to progress in the experience is out of reach, right? What if it's outside of my play space? What if it's through the wall of my apartment, which I see this happen to users all the time. And part of that is having really good tools for accessing objects that are out of reach, where again, like if I am like, if an object is just out of reach, can you highlight the object and I can still hit the grab button and pull it to my hand, right? Or are you actually making me like overlap with the object? Or if the object is here, can I magnet it to my hand, right? Games that don't have those kinds of assistive controls, honestly, they don't tend to feel very good because it's hard. It's actually very difficult to perform a lot of these activities. Like if I drop an object onto the floor, then I have to go and I actually have to like bend over all the way down and pick it up off of the floor, which is actually not like a very fun or comfortable thing to do like constantly if you're playing a game for an hour. So I think that's one thing is like you want to play test your game in a variety of space configurations, because from my perspective, like if your game cannot be played standing in the middle of a space and never actually taking a step left or right in any direction, it's maybe not ready for like the wider audience, because again, like to your point, like a lot of people don't have like huge play spaces. So
cool. We have five or more questions from Dragan, so I split them in separate questions. Which companies are currently leading the VR technology advancement?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, in terms of hardware, Meta pretty much owns the space right now. I'm really excited about what Sony has already revealed about their next generation headset. There's rumors about Apple coming in, but I think it's really them. It's like there's a handful of large hardware companies, but the real technology advancements, I think, are not necessarily going to be hardware related. I think it's going to be about better and better software. I mean, so if you've seen a lot of the things that Unreal Engine is doing in Unreal Engine 5 and creating these really like incredibly performant optimization systems for complex scenes, that's something that's really exciting. But I think, like in terms of just hardware, it's Meta. Like they own the space right now. Nobody else really has anything that's like coming even close. So there's lots of like interesting novelty hardware that other people are making, but they're pretty much dominating it. I think that's going to change. That's going to change in the next 5 years. Like Pico, the Chinese VR headset company, I think they've got a compelling offering, and I think we're going to see a few more companies that will make very similar products. I mean, one of the nice things about the Meta Quest and also the Pico headset is they're built on the same Qualcomm chipset, and Qualcomm just has a standardized like spec that they give to hardware companies that they're like, you want to make a VR headset? We make the chipset. Here's what it looks like to make it. Just make one. So I think we're going to see some more competitive things happen in the hardware space. The problem there is that Meta can subsidize headsets forever, and everyone else is going to have a hard time competing on price and on content for a while. So.
Yeah. So the second question was, should we expect more affordable or smaller mass VR products? But you already answered, because
smaller. Yes, like the headsets will get smaller, I think, over the next few years, because we'll start moving to shorter throw pancake lenses. So we'll get thinner headsets, but the price, I mean, maybe Meta will come down, but it's already like the Quest is the cheapest and most accessible video game console in the world right now. Like it's cheaper than PlayStation, Xbox, and the high-end Switch. So like, I don't know. I don't think it's going to get that much cheaper.
Yeah. So of course, Have you ever tried those like glasses that are now on the web? I think it's something like the crowdfunding project or something where you can actually play games on them. It's not like completely, it's not a VR at all, but it's
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
display. Does that
Uh-huh.
make sense?
Yeah, I've seen that. I mean, what you're talking about is like, I have a pair of glasses or a headset where it just puts a giant
Yeah, display in
2D
front of you.
screen, a giant display, and I can play my other games. Honestly, I think that's one of the most compelling things about the PSVR 2 is that it's high resolution enough and high quality enough that it might actually be a better experience for playing normal PlayStation 5 games than just playing on a TV. Just like putting on your VR headset and playing Horizon Forbidden West in your
Yeah,
headset instead of playing it on your
yes.
TV, right? Like, unless you have a 75-inch 4K OLED
And you stand
display.
on 1 meter in front of it. Yeah, it
Right.
will be the same.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I play games in my VR headset. Like I've been playing a lot of Vampire Survivors. And
I was
I've been
playing that last night.
yeah, I've been playing Vampire Survivors in my VR headset. I literally like I lay on the floor in my living room. I put Vampire Survivors on the ceiling and I play it with the Quest controllers.
It's so
So
cool.
it's
Nice.
great. It's great.
So, since you are into the sphere here, are there enough AR or VR developers now that are developing
No,
games? Do we need some
no.
fresh blood in the field?
Oh my God, so much. Yeah. I mean, if you talk to anyone at any of the major companies, any of the big studios, or even me, the answer is there's nowhere near enough. Um, but part of that is that it's so hard. It is so hard to be good at this because it's you have to be really good at game development, but you also have to be really good at all of these other things. You have to be a great environmental designer, a great like product and like industrial designer. You have to understand like human psychology. You have to the level at which you have to be able to operate is just so much more difficult than traditional games or traditional software. Like it's just the the issues just keep like becoming more and more difficult. So but yeah, there's a huge demand right now. Like the platforms want more studios making titles. And people are making money making VR games right now. I mean, if you look at the number of titles on Quest versus the number of titles on Steam, right? Like Steam and the consoles now are just really crowded. And
Yeah.
VR is new and it's incredibly difficult, but that also means that there's a huge opportunity. Like
Yes, of course.
if you have a great breakaway title on VR, you can sell it to like a much bigger percentage of the market than you ever could on console or Steam, just
Yeah,
because the market is so much
polluted.
smaller and there's much less competition.
Yes, yes. The Steam and the consoles are the market is polluted with all the garbage, and even good games like as you mentioned, Vampire Survivors. It's very hard to get into the top charts so we can be noticed. And as you said, in the VR,
Exactly.
it's pretty much for at least for now, it's clean waters, so you can
Yeah.
swim easily.
Yeah.
And the last question is there any like a VR codex for the devs there? Like you can do this and you cannot do that?
uh no. I mean, there's a handful of resources that are scattered around the web, but we're still not in a place where there are like best practices. um like we're just not there yet because so much of this is so new and it's so complex. But that said, like the best practices exist in the best games. So like if there is a codex, it's the best games that are out. Like, like play Half-Life Alex, play Job Simulator, like see what the like most well-reviewed best games are doing. Like how are they handling these like movement systems? How are they handling object interactions? um, that's where that exists. But also, I'm this is like a shameless plug, but I'm working on a book, like a VR design theory book, for Oxford University Press that'll be out. It'll be out in like a year. So
Cool. Well, I don't have any more questions. Thank you very much again. Good luck with the next titles that you are developing or publishing or whatever.
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
I hope you make the games, the past games, even more smarter and funnier and like better to play. We are waiting for Among Us the VR, and
Yeah, Among Us VR out later
y-
this year.
yeah.
From Robot Teddy Shell Games and Innersloth. So, but also, yeah, like if if you're interested in making a VR game, like we're funding VR games at Robot Teddy now, and supporting VR developers. And if you just want to chat, you want to talk about funding, you want to talk about design, my email again, it's on the front page of our website. You can DM me on Twitter. I'm down to chat with anybody who's trying to make something in this space. I'm more than happy to spend a little bit of time with. So
Great.